Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. It is our pleasure now to introduce this week's special guest outsider, who was in fact the keynote speaker at the Liberty Fest conference in Queensland. He is Dan Mitchell from the Centre for Freedom and Prosperity, one of the eminent think tanks of the United States. He's formerly from the Cato Institute and also the Heritage Foundation. So he's among the blue chip campaigners for freedom. He describes it as pushing the rock uphill in Washington, D.C., otherwise known to the deplorables as the Swamp. Welcome to Outsiders.
As a swamp creature, I'm delighted to be here.
So, Dan, you have spent your life, your real expertise is in tax competitiveness. And we're at a significant moment for the United States and indeed potentially for Australia and the world if Donald Trump is able to execute what is a very bold plan. Give our viewers the thumbnail sketch, the sort of three-point summary of what Donald Trump has asked the Congress to do to make America more competitive in relation to taxation.
His plan has a whole bunch of features, increasing the standard deduction so families can earn more money before the tax kicks in. He wants to reduce the tax penalty on new business investment. But unquestionably, the number one flagship item in his plan is to take the 35% corporate rate down to 20. He originally wanted 15, but when you negotiate with Congress, you have to give in a little bit. But they've agreed in theory to a 20% corporate tax rate. If that happens in one fell swoop, I think that's going to make America far more competitive because right now we have the highest corporate tax rate in the entire developed world. Higher than France, higher than Sweden. It's ridiculous.
Really? Well, not higher than Australia, I doubt. But is that just reducing taxes for the top?
It's reducing taxes for corporations, right? Because it's pretty much, it's not technically a flat tax because you can earn a tiny bit of money at a lower rate, but for all practical purposes.
Help the lower paid? Or how does bringing down taxes like that at the top end help the lower end?
Well, it's reducing taxes on businesses. But the reason that helps ordinary people is because when you have a lower corporate tax rate, there's a greater incentive to invest. When you invest more, it means workers get to work with more technology, machinery, equipment, and every economic theory. It doesn't matter if Paul Krugman was sitting here. He will agree with the proposition that workers get paid on the basis of what they produce. And what they produce is a function of the quality of the equipment they're working with. So if we get more investment, we'll have more job creation, we'll have higher wages. There's no question in my mind cutting taxes on corporations will be very, very good for workers.
Well, look, we've got the smartest audience on Australian television. And we ask quite a bit of them. We are going to ask them to look at two slides that you can hit pause if you need to digest the contents. But we're going to start, I think, with the Rand curve. You are an eminent economist. So just explain to our audience what we are looking at in that curve, what is in the up axis on the left and the horizontal axis on the right.
The horizontal axis is the size of government, and the vertical axis is economic performance. And what it describes is the relationship between how big your government gets and whether or not your economy is prospering. And when you have a relatively small government focusing on core responsibilities like rule of law, a court system, maybe some education and infrastructure, government actually is good for the economy. Right. But the problem is, as the government gets bigger and bigger and sort of takes on all these welfare state responsibilities, especially when it's all done at a central government level rather than dispersed among states and localities, then you have what's in the academic literature is found to be a very strong negative relationship. When government gets bigger, the economy gets weaker. And you know, there's dozens of studies, but if you were to sort of take an average of them, if you have government above 20% of GDP, you're probably hurting your economy. Now, that's bad news because the U.S. and Australia were both over 35% of GDP.
So looking at that curve, the peak of that curve is those governments which are small enough to provide those critical services you're talking about before they start getting into massive welfare. Yeah. So who would be at the top of that curve, and where would Australia and America be down that slope?
Well, if you look at the curve, the top of the curve would basically be Hong Kong and Singapore. Right. Or, you know, if you want to do history, that would be where the U.S. and Australia and other countries were maybe, 80 years ago or something like that. That if you're sort of halfway down the curve, and you don't want to be going down the curve, but if you're halfway down the curve, that's where the U.S. and Australia and maybe countries like Switzerland would be right now. And then the very bottom of the curve, where government is very big and there's almost no growth, or in some cases negative growth, that's where you find France and Italy and Greece.
And at the very end, North Korea,
yeah, well,
there's no economy at all.
Yeah, well, they're under the line because the government is basically 100% of the economy is government.
So how do France or in Italy, which we often see ourselves heading towards, how do they lift themselves back out of that?
Well, that's a challenge because if you're Greece and you have 60% of your voting age population living off the government, are they ever going to vote for a Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan?
Dan, in Australia, it's 50% now. 50% of the country work, 50% of the country don't work.
And we're close to that ratio in the U.S., and that worries me a lot because we have in all of our Western nations demographic decline. It means we're having fewer children and we're living longer. Now, every year older I get, I like the idea that we're living longer. But when you have welfare states that were created with the presumption of a population pyramid, a few old people, lots of workers, and a big generation of children, well, that pyramid is becoming a cylinder. We're living longer, we're having fewer kids, and the welfare state that was designed 50 years ago simply isn't going to work. So Greece, it's already blown up. Australia and the U.S., if we don't make a lot of changes, we'll blow up. Now, you guys have an advantage. I know when I talk to Aussies, they all have complaints about the superannuation system. But you know what? I would trade you in a heartbeat our Social Security system for your super system because your system is based on real savings. Ours is based on debt and political promises.
So, taking that thought, if Australia refuses to cut its spending, okay, it's got its super, but it refuses to cut its spending, and it's going to keep on sliding where are we heading unless we get our debt under control?
Well, I think ultimately we're all heading to be Greece. And it's not just an economic point. I mean, I'm a pointy-headed economist. I'll bore people to death. Marginal tax rates and, government consumption and transfer outlays. But here's what really, I think, drives the issue. And you hit on it. When you have too many people in your population living off the government and they think it's perfectly fine morally, oh, well, that rich guy has an obligation to support me, that is what's called societal capital. And your societal capital is just as important as your human capital and your physical capital. And once you have a society where everyone thinks it's okay to live off everybody else, where does that lead?
You were first motivated in the as a college student to get political. You weren't politically active until you got to college, and then something about that early Reagan era sort of mobilised you politically and engaged you. One of the most influential thinkers in that period gave his name to another graph, the second one and second of two. We're going to ask our audience to have a look at, which is called the Laffer Curve. And this is the compelling argument for, well, you explain it.
Well, the bottom of the chart is the tax rate, 0% on the left, 100% on the right. And the vertical axis is how much tax revenue you get. And it's a very common sense idea. If there's a 0% tax rate, how much do you get? Zero.
Yeah.
How much does the government get? If you have a 100% tax rate, how much does the government get?
Zero.
Well, it might not be zero. You could have some...
Close to. There'll be no economic activity.
You might have some genetic communists who would continue to work and give the government money. But for the most part, again, every single economist in the world will agree that there's a curve. What they argue about is where the revenue maximizing point is.
Yep.
And that's shown on this curve. But you know what? Never once in my life have I cared about the revenue maximizing rate because I don't wake up and say, how can I maximize money for government?
Well, you don't work for the ABC. We want to be at the growth maximizing
so where should we be to get that maximum?
The growth maximizing point is where you generate enough revenue to finance, let's go back to the round curve now, to finance the amount of government that is growth maximizing, which I think is going to be somewhere maybe around 10 to 15% of GDP. The academic researchers say 20, but I think it's actually below that. But again, it doesn't matter. We're at 35, 40.
Well, you would have liked our famous, our version of, I suppose, of Donald Trump a long time ago, Kerry Packer, a billionaire guy who said he didn't want to give any more tax to the government because they spent it so badly. And that was his entire philosophy.
Can I ask you, your expertise is really tax competitiveness, and you study the regimes of different countries around the world. One of my frustrations with the sort of globalist worldview of the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, these guys are going around cheerleading for developing economies to push their tax rates up. Explain that to me.
Well, the first thing you should understand about these international bureaucracies, yes, they do run around the world urging higher taxes. They, by treaty, get tax-free salaries. Oh. So imagine if I got, and by the way, they're very generous salaries. So imagine I'm getting a very generous salary, and you're a citizen of a country and you're the politician. I go to you and say, you know what? Higher taxes are good. I don't pay them. I don't care. You're a politician. You like the idea of getting more loot. And then this poor citizen is just going to get, pillaged.
So they get the Hippocratic Award, but why do they do it?
Well, they do it for two reasons. One, you tend to have a lot of just statist left-wing orientation among people that become international bureaucrats. But also, let's be honest, the IMF doesn't do things unless the major G7 countries okay it. Yeah. And so when you have Treasury Department bureaucrats in the US with ATO bureaucrats in Australia and Inland Revenue bureaucrats in the UK, and they get together at these meetings, they have a pro-big government mindset. So it's the insiders directing the insiders to screw over the outsiders.
That's exactly
We have seen this in India with this determination to force India to roll out these vast so-called wind farms, which are not farms because farms are productive enterprises. Tell us about your view on the economics of forcing renewables down the throats of developing countries.
Well, this is really sad because we're rich by world standards. We had our period of strong growth. We became rich countries when government was very small and you didn't have all these crazy regulations and mandates and controls and things like that. And now we're basically saying to India and other countries, oh, you can't use the recipe that works. Instead, you're going to be our little experimental playpen, and we're going to make you do these economically inefficient approaches to energy. And ultimately, the victims of that are the ordinary poor citizens of India.
We've actually got a slide there, which we should put up in a second, but it's basically the World Bank, and there's been a criticism of the World Bank that it's now actually become the anti-development bank because of this commitment to climate change, or dogma and regulation and the whole idea of climate change. You have the IMF, the World Bank, the EU, the United Nations, all committed to this thing. They're actually impoverishing the poor people in places like India, who now have to burn wood for fuel because they don't have electricity. They are actually working against development. Would that be a correct analysis?
If anything, it understates it. I mean, if you go to the World Bank and the UN and the OECD and the IMF websites, you will find report after report that says financing for development, resources for development, and it's all just it's buzzwords, but it basically means government should get more tax revenue to finance a bigger government, and that's somehow good for growth. Now, again, we became rich in the U.S., you became rich in Australia when government was 10% of GDP. No government, no country has ever become rich with a big government, and yet that's what the IMF and these groups are trying to impose. And do they just not care? I don't know, but I want to tear my hair out.
We on this show kind of were given birth by a property developer from New York, and so we love him, and we've got a strong bias in his favour, but we're not uncritical of Donald Trump, but we are massively critical of the phalanx of Trump hatred, which comes from the sort of inner establishment swamp voices. I'd love you to give our audience a sense of what you think are the actual, real positive achievements. It's only a relatively young administration. But on the economic side, what can we say has been constructive about the Trump administration so far?
It depends what hat I'm wearing. If I put on my judiciary hat, Donald Trump is appointing good people to the federal courts. If I put on my regulation hat, Donald Trump has been very good on that issue.
Reducing regulation.
Of reducing regulation and expanding energy and things like that. Those things will be very helpful for America in the long run in terms of jobs, wages, competitiveness. If I put on my we have to reform entitlement hat, I'm not so sure. If I put on my tax reform hat, the jury's still out. there's a good plan. If it goes through, I'll be very happy. If I put on my will there be nuclear war with North Korea hat, I'm not a foreign policy guy, so I can't really answer that. But I hope we're going to be around to talk a year from now.
What is happening? Just tell us, as Australians are sort of sweating, you know, as if we live in a sauna.
Which we will be this summer.
Which we will be, as we're looking at the real prospect of rationing electricity, like, you know, a Soviet bakery with sort of 3 bread rolls on the front and a queue of 100 people standing there shivering in the cold. Tell me, what is happening in the US energy markets? Because it has been, Donald Trump has said he's committed not just to energy independence, but to energy domination. What does that look like in the US economy right now?
Well, the good news is that it started even before Trump took office, because even though Obama had more of this, anti-energy mindset, fracking, the technology, the development on private land was great. And that, in effect, got the ball rolling even before Trump got there. And now Trump is doing things like pipelines and offshore exploration. But the main thing is the mindset is different. The mindset is no civilized society has ever created prosperity without energy consumption. And Donald Trump wants America to become richer. Now, he might not have all the pieces right on, say, budget control and things like that, but on energy, I think he's doing good things for the country. We're not going to have the kind of disaster you have in Germany and Spain, where your industries are uncompetitive because of these green energy mandates that force you to pay twice the market price in the world.
Well, Dan, Bjorn Lomborg, who analyses climate change, he was going to be at university in Australia, but all the lefties booted him out, and that wasn't allowed to happen. But he said that the cost of the Paris Agreement as it stands is $1 to $2 trillion out of the global economy every year for the rest of the century. Would you agree with that sort of analysis? And what does it do if you take $1 to $2 trillion out of the economy every year?
I'm a public finance economist, so I can't vouch for his specific numbers.
Figures, sure.
But he has a very, very good reputation. He's very prudent. He's actually a big environmentalist, but he wants to be rational about it. And I think what you have with a lot of this global warming ideology, it's virtue signaling. It's like, oh, well, I'm at the IMF, I fly around in my private jet, I get my huge tax-free salary. Wouldn't it be good? Won't I feel better about myself if I sort of deny these peasants around the world from being able to have cheap energy?
You've just met all our senior government ministers, haven't you? That sounds exactly like them.
We have lots of them in the United States as well. And I really do think it's virtue signaling. It's a religion. That's really what it is, because it doesn't matter whether they're lying about some of their numbers. It doesn't matter whether they're exposed for some bad methodology. It's just a good thing in their hearts.
Well, I just want to say to the manager of human resources at Fairfax Media, you need to go out and get that padded, safe room back out and mobilise the counsellors, because our guest has just said one nice sentence about fracking, and I'm sure the whole joint has gone... but we want to say to you, Dan Mitchell, it has been an absolute pleasure. This show is the last refuge for middle-aged white guys in suits. You will be welcome back at any stage. We love your effort to push the stone uphill. We wish you well in your efforts to drain the swamp, and we want to thank you for joining us on Outsiders.
Great. I was glad to be on the programme.
Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, we will be right back with the Bingley Award.
Lefty Lunacy.
Lots to do. We've got lots to do, so make yourself a cup of tea if you've got access to energy, and we'll be right back.